The initial weeks of captivity unfolded in an atmosphere thick with tension, silence, and guarded glances as hundreds of Japanese prisoners of war were ushered through the barbed wire gates of the American camp. Most arrived clad in tattered uniforms, their sweat-soaked and dirt-caked attire bearing witness to months of relentless battle and eventual surrender. The grueling marches along dusty island roads, coupled with the oppressive tropical heat, had left their bodies drained. Yet nothing could have prepared them for the peculiar environment that awaited inside. After undergoing registration, medical examinations, and receiving basic supplies, they were herded into a large wooden structure where overhead pipes crisscrossed the ceiling. The sight halted many in their tracks. This structure bore no resemblance to anything they had encountered in the Pacific. Rows of nozzles jutted out from metal lines, each positioned above a drain. The American guards, efficient and brisk, gestured for them to strip and form a line. It was then that many realized this wasn't merely about being detained. They were expected to wash. Among the prisoners, confusion rippled like waves on a pond. Bathing for Japanese soldiers during wartime was rare, often improvised in rivers or seas, always constrained by supply shortages. Soap was considered a luxury item. Yet here, under the custody of their sworn adversaries, they found themselves directed toward an organized ritual of cleansing. Some clung to their belongings, half expecting a trick, while others whispered nervously about the steam rising from the pipes. Tales spread by their officers prior to surrender echoed in their minds. The Americans were brutal. Capture meant humiliation. Prisoners would be treated worse than animals. Now, staring at gleaming metal showers, they wondered if this was some concealed cruelty. The guards, growing impatient with hesitation, barked orders in English and motioned again. Shoes, belts, tunics, all had to be removed. Reluctantly, hands fumbled with buttons, revealing scarred bodies hardened by jungle campaigns. The prisoners felt exposed, humiliated before strangers and peers alike. Still, they complied, clutching the bars of soap thrust into their palms. Then came the hiss of water. From the overhead pipes gushed streams of clean liquid warm to the touch. The sudden warmth startled the men. For a fleeting moment they froze, bracing for pain. Instead, as the water cascaded down their backs and shoulders, washing away layers of filth, a strange calm enveloped them. Some closed their eyes, allowing the dirt to swirl into the drains. Others cautiously rubbed the rough soap, testing whether it was truly permitted. Gradually, the initial fear dissolved into quiet awe. They hadn't felt such heat and freshness in months, even years. In the islands where they had fought, water had been rationed, showers non-existent, lice and disease rampant. To stand beneath a stream of hot water without buckets, without shouting officers, without restrictions, felt like an almost unimaginable luxury. Here, in enemy hands, they were cleaner than they had ever been in their own army barracks. When they emerged, towels awaited them. Thick cotton towels folded neatly in stacks. Many prisoners touched them as though handling artifacts from another realm. Awkwardly drying their bodies, unused to such fabric, they shuffled out, hair dripping, skin flushed from the warmth. An unmistakable murmur of astonishment passed among them. The dread that had gripped them upon entering the shower hall was replaced by bewilderment. Had their captors truly offered comfort instead of cruelty? That first encounter with the camp showers lingered in their minds long afterward. It marked the beginning of a series of revelations that challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy. The experience transcended mere physical cleansing. It forced them to confront the chasm between what they had believed and what they now lived. The modern shower, with its endless hot water and soap, became emblematic of something greater. The realization that captivity might not mean degradation, but rather an unexpected glimpse into another civilization's way of life. Suspicion and cultural clash. When the first showers concluded and the prisoners filed back into the barracks, a heavy silence blanketed the room. They sat on wooden benches, some clutching their folded uniforms, others awkwardly rubbing their damp hair with the thick towels, still uncertain whether they had experienced a blessing or a hidden threat. Many avoided eye contact, as though speaking openly might break some unspoken rule. Deep within, however, unease gnawed at them. Countless warnings had drilled into their minds that capture by Americans equated to dishonor, torture, and death. In whispered briefings before battles, Japanese officers had painted vivid images of sadistic enemy camps where starvation and abuse awaited. Yet here the first act imposed upon them was bathing with soap and hot water. To many it seemed suspicious, too kind, too civilized. One prisoner, a former naval mechanic from Yokosuka, recalled how Allied propaganda leaflets had depicted smiling prisoners of war receiving food and rest. He had always dismissed those papers as lies crafted to weaken Japanese morale. Now, standing clean for the first time in months, he remembered those illustrations with a chill. Could some of them actually be true? But a darker thought crept into his mind, more terrifying still. What if the showers were not intended for cleanliness at all? Rumors spread quickly, especially among those with sharper memories of wartime propaganda. Some whispered the words, gas chambers, drawing comparisons to vague stories about the Germans in Europe. Though few knew details, the idea that Americans might use showers for some hidden cruelty began circulating in hushed tones. The guards noticed the hesitation. They watched groups of prisoners pause at the doorways, their faces clouded with mistrust. Orders were repeated, and translators explained in broken Japanese that bathing was simply mandatory hygiene. Yet suspicion did not vanish easily. For men trained to believe surrender was a fate worse than death, any act of comfort carried the taste of deception. They wondered if the soap they were given was poisoned, if the warmth of the water concealed something sinister. Some even refused to wash thoroughly, merely wetting their arms and backs before stepping away. The cultural clash made the moment even more jarring. In Japan, bathing held deep cultural roots tied to ritual purification in hot springs and shared communal baths. War had stripped away that tradition, leaving soldiers unwashed for weeks, plagued by lice and constant infections. The camp showers, in contrast, were industrial in design, rows of steel pipes and drains, efficient yet devoid of privacy, operating like clockwork. To the Americans, this was practical hygiene, nothing more. To the Japanese, it felt alien, mechanical, almost dehumanizing. It was a ritual stripped of its spiritual meaning, transformed into something functional yet unsettling. For days, conversations among the prisoners revolved around the same questions. Why would the Americans waste hot water on captives? Why provide soap, towels, and time when they could have simply left them filthy? Was it genuine generosity, or part of some larger plan to break them mentally? Theories multiplied in the dimly lit barracks. Some argued that the showers were a form of control, a means to weaken resistance by softening men with comfort. Others whispered that hidden chemicals might be mixed into the water. Fear clung to them, reinforced by memories of warnings from their superiors. Yet no punishment followed. No hidden cruelty emerged. The men returned to the barracks at night, still breathing, still alive, cleaner than before. Slowly, suspicion began to erode, replaced by a quieter, reluctant curiosity. The Americans repeated the process the next day and the day after that. Soap continued to be distributed. Guards ensured every man entered the shower hall, and still, nothing terrible happened. Suspicion remained, but now it mingled with another feeling: confusion. What kind of enemy would care if their prisoners smelled clean or carried fewer lice? For men raised to believe capture was a fate worse than death, the realization was as unsettling as the showers themselves. Hygiene as discipline. The daily rhythm of hygiene soon became an ingrained part of camp life, though initially it felt forced upon the Japanese prisoners. Each morning or evening, depending on the schedule, guards lined them up and marched them to the shower hall. At the entrance, they received soap wrapped in paper, its chemical scent sharp and unfamiliar, and towels often stamped with military supply markings. The routine was mechanical. Strip, step under the streams, wash thoroughly, dry, dress, and return. But as days turned into weeks, the prisoners began to understand that this was not a temporary measure. Cleanliness was a rule, a discipline enforced as rigorously as curfews and roll calls. The Americans explained hygiene standards through interpreters, demonstrating how to use soap properly. They insisted that men scrub not only their arms and faces, but also their feet, hair, and hidden folds of the body. Lice checks followed, conducted by medics who meticulously inspected clothing seams and bedding. Delousing powder was issued alongside clean undergarments. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers realized that the enemy treated disease prevention as seriously as they treated food or weapons. To the Americans, hygiene was not a luxury but a necessity for order, health, and discipline within the camp. For the prisoners, this routine carried a strange mixture of humiliation and fascination. On one hand, they were stripped of individuality, compelled to wash on command like schoolboys. On the other, they discovered that life free from constant itching, sores, and infected wounds was surprisingly tolerable. A corporal who had fought on Guadalcanal remembered weeks when his unit bathed only once in muddy streams, while tropical ulcers spread among his comrades. In contrast, after just a few weeks of enforced showers, the sores on his legs began to heal, and the chronic cough that plagued him faded. It was a quiet, undeniable improvement, an irony that gnawed at his pride. Language barriers caused endless confusion at first. Many prisoners did not understand when guards shouted about washing hair or scrubbing feet, so they did the bare minimum. When they tried to skip steps, they were forced back under the streams, watched impatiently until the soap lathered properly. Some resented the interference, muttering that it was degrading. Yet even in their resistance, they could not deny the results. Their uniforms, laundered regularly by camp procedures, no longer carried the foul stench of rotting cloth. Blankets smelled faintly of detergent instead of sweat and mildew. The barracks, once suffocating with the odor of unwashed bodies, grew more tolerable, even for those who never admitted it aloud. Gradually, the sense of suspicion gave way to habit. Prisoners began to anticipate the routine, lining up with less resistance. They learned to scrub more thoroughly, to dry themselves with care, to fold the towels as instructed. Some even compared soap types, noting which ones lathered better or smelled less harsh. It was a small detail, but for men stripped of freedom, such comparisons became a form of conversation, a way to fill long hours of idleness. Hygiene had transformed from a command into a shared ritual, something that quietly bound them together. What struck many most deeply was the realization that their captors expected them to maintain dignity, even in captivity. To be forced into showers and provided with soap was not only about controlling disease, it was about enforcing a certain standard of humanity. In the Japanese army, soldiers had been taught that comfort was weakness, that enduring filth and pain was a mark of honor. Now, under the discipline of their enemy, they were shown that regular washing could be as much a part of discipline as carrying a rifle. This clash of values unsettled them, but it also sowed the first seeds of reluctant respect for the strange, relentless order of their captors. The transformative power of cleanliness. The first time hot water cascaded over their shoulders, many Japanese prisoners gasped, some even stepping back as though scalded. Warmth, steady and controlled, poured from the overhead nozzles in a way they had never experienced before. For men accustomed to makeshift washing in cold rivers or hastily filled buckets, the sensation was almost luxurious. Steam rose quickly, curling through the air and softening the harsh fluorescent lights of the barrack-style room. The soap, pungent and foreign, foamed thickly on their skin, lifting away months of grime. They rubbed it tentatively at first, then with more vigor, marveling at how the lather clung and rinsed away with ease. For some, the moment was overwhelming. They remembered how during long campaigns in the jungles officers had warned them to conserve every drop of water, that cleanliness was secondary to survival. On remote islands, baths were rare. Soldiers wiped themselves with rags, their skin perpetually sticky with sweat, salt, and dust. The few occasions when hot water could be heated in cans or drums were considered rare blessings, shared among dozens of men. Here, however, each prisoner stood under his own stream of warmth as though such luxury were endless. It was not simply bathing, it was immersion in another world. The towels provided afterward deepened the shock. Thick and absorbent, they were unlike the thin cloth soldiers had once used in Japanese barracks, where men often had to share rags. Prisoners pressed the towels to their faces, inhaling the faint chemical scent of detergent. Their skin felt renewed, pores open, the sticky film of the tropics finally washed away. It was more than physical relief. It stirred emotions they had long suppressed. Some recalled family baths back home, memories of mothers drawing hot water in tubs before the war consumed their lives. Others thought of public bathhouses, now distant echoes of a civilian past. The camp showers reawakened those sensations, but now framed by the strangeness of captivity. The Americans treated the routine without sentiment, issuing soap and towels with the same blunt efficiency as rations. For them, it was procedure, disease prevention, morale management, order. Yet to the prisoners, it became a quiet revelation. The irony was bitter. They had expected cruelty, yet here they encountered comfort beyond what they had known, even among their own forces. Some felt shame, believing such indulgence weakened them. Others embraced it silently, grateful for a moment that allowed their aching bodies to feel human again. Over time, the showers reshaped their daily existence. Instead of scratching at lice or ignoring festering sores, they learned that hot water soothed pain and sped healing. Their hair, once greasy and matted, grew soft and easier to comb. The smell of sweat that had clung to their uniforms diminished, replaced by the faint sharpness of disinfectant soap. Even the barracks air became lighter, less suffocating, as regular bathing reduced the odors of so many bodies living in confinement. Prisoners began to notice these changes with astonishment, quietly acknowledging that they were healthier than they had been during combat. The paradox gnawed at their minds. How could the enemy, whom they had been taught to despise, provide them with care that their own army had denied? The showers were not just about cleanliness. They were proof of a system so organized, so abundant in resources, that it could extend comfort even to captives. Standing under the streams of hot water, they could not help but feel both envy and unease. It was a reminder of how different this world was from the one they had left behind, and how far Japan lagged behind in offering such basic dignity to its own soldiers. Reflections on contrasts. At night, when the barracks dimmed and the long rows of prisoners lay on their cots, conversations often drifted back to comparisons with their former lives in the Imperial Army. The subject was not weapons or battles, but the strange discovery of hygiene. Men who had marched across Burma, who had fought in the jungles of the Philippines, now whispered about soap, towels, and the shock of hot water. It was not the sort of topic soldiers had ever considered honorable, but the contrast was too striking to ignore. In the Japanese military, bathing had been a rare event carried out only when circumstances allowed. Officers spoke of endurance, of ignoring the body's discomfort, of embracing filth as a sign of toughness. Soldiers often went weeks without washing, their skin layered with grime, their uniforms stiff with salt from dried sweat. Lice and fleas infested clothing seams, tropical ulcers spread untreated. The stench of unwashed bodies clung to every march, every camp, every night in the field. To complain about it was seen as weakness, unworthy of a true warrior. Yet in these American camps, cleanliness was enforced, as though it were a law equal to discipline itself. One prisoner, a former sergeant, recalled aloud how his unit on New Guinea had shared a single rusty basin of water for 30 men. They had rinsed their faces and hands, but there had been no question of real bathing. He compared it bitterly to the endless streams of hot water in captivity. Another man muttered that back in Manchuria, his regiment had suffered frostbite, not only from cold but from wearing the same unwashed socks for months. Disease had crippled entire units more effectively than bullets. Now, here in America, every man scrubbed his feet daily, and medics checked for infection as if they were valued patients. The irony was so sharp that it stung. This recognition spread quietly through the camp. Even those who clung to pride could not deny that their bodies were improving. Rashes faded, lice disappeared, sores healed. Stomachs that had once twisted from parasites now settled with regular washing and cleaner clothes. Prisoners began to connect these improvements with the routines they had once resisted. For the first time, they understood that hygiene was not softness. It was strength, a weapon against disease more powerful than stubborn endurance. The reflections were not only physical but cultural. Many remembered the deep traditions of communal baths in Japan, onsen in the mountains, wooden tubs in village homes. Bathing had once been part of life, tied to family and ritual. War had stripped it away, reducing men to creatures surviving in dirt. Now, in captivity, the enemy had returned to them what their own army had denied. The paradox unsettled them. Some spoke of it with longing, remembering their mothers heating kettles in the evenings. Others fell silent, ashamed that it was not Japan but America that had restored this dignity. The guards did not understand the depth of this shock. For them, hygiene was practical, tied to regulations and public health. They issued orders without sentiment, never imagining that the routine showers carried such profound meaning for the prisoners. But within the wire fences, men lay awake, staring at the rafters, realizing that the very structure of military life they had known was flawed. It was not strength to endure filth. It was not honor to ignore disease. They began to wonder, if America cared this much for the health of captives, how much more must it care for its own soldiers? The thought was uncomfortable, yet impossible to silence. Routine as Redemption Week stretched into months, and the hygiene routine that once felt alien began to carve deep grooves into the rhythm of captivity. Every man knew the order of the day: wake up, roll call, meals, and at scheduled intervals, the march to the shower hall. What had once been met with suspicion now became an almost unspoken expectation. The guards no longer needed to bark as loudly, and the prisoners no longer shuffled with such reluctance. They moved in steady lines, soap tucked into their palms, towels draped across their shoulders as though it had always been this way. The transformation was not merely physical but mental. The Japanese soldiers, stripped of their weapons and their cause, had regained something unexpected, a fragment of dignity. Their uniforms, laundered regularly, no longer carried the stench of decay. Their bodies, washed and examined, were free of lice and festering wounds. Even the mirror-like reflections in small puddles after rain revealed healthier faces, cheeks less gaunt, skin less scarred by sores. It was an improvement that none could deny, even if they never admitted it aloud. Cleanliness began to symbolize more than survival. It became proof that they had not been entirely reduced to shadows of men. The effects rippled through the barracks. Coughing diminished. The relentless scratching of lice-ridden scalps disappeared, and blankets smelled faintly of soap rather than mold. Guards remarked, sometimes with a smirk, that the Japanese prisoners looked more orderly than when they had first arrived. Some prisoners, embarrassed by this observation, still resisted internally, clinging to the belief that such routines were meant to soften them. Yet the truth was plain. They felt stronger. Their wounds healed faster, their sleep deepened, and their energy, though still bound by captivity, grew steadier. For some, this change stirred pride rather than shame. They began to fold their towels neatly after drying, to polish their boots with greater care, to keep the barracks swept and orderly. It reminded them of old traditions back home, of the meticulous rituals of Japanese households. Cleanliness, they realized, was not submission to the enemy. It was reclaiming fragments of themselves, fragments buried under the mud and chaos of war. Even conversations shifted. Men once too weary to speak now traded quiet remarks about the strangeness of feeling refreshed, about the irony that they were healthier in captivity than in the field. American medics, practical and unsentimental, kept records of the improvements. Fewer cases of dysentery, fewer infestations, fewer deaths. For the Americans, it was proof that the system worked. For the Japanese, it was an awakening. They could not help but notice that their captors treated hygiene as a matter of discipline and respect, not a privilege but a requirement. This lesson unsettled them because it contrasted so sharply with their own military ethos, where endurance of filth was a badge of honor. Here, the opposite was true. Cleanliness was order, and order was strength. Over time, the suspicion that had once clung to the showers eroded almost entirely. Men no longer whispered about poison in the soap or hidden cruelty behind the water pipes. Instead, they began to anticipate the warmth, even to crave it. The ritual became something to look forward to, a moment of physical relief in a life otherwise stripped of freedom. Some prisoners lingered under the streams longer than allowed, closing their eyes and letting the water cascade over them, as if washing away not only dirt but memories of defeat. In the quiet of those routines, many discovered that hygiene was more than a rule enforced by guards. It was a restoration of dignity, a way to feel human again, even within the barbed wire. It was a subtle, undeniable transformation, one that changed not only their bodies but their very sense of what it meant to endure.